Okay. Well, yeah. So this is just kind of an idea I've had for a while of trying to study while working. So I'm just gonna kind of record and going through a study guide or a series of questions given to me from a professor, my natural resource management uh, administration and law class. Yeah, so he gave out a bunch of questions, and I'm kind of just gonna run through the questions and run through the answers I've kind of formulated so far, and yeah, just kind of run through the answers, read through them, talk through them a little bit, and try to. I mean, yeah, I've gone through and answered pretty much most of them. There's a few that I haven't. I might have got stuck on a little bit, and so those I might ramble through a little bit, but overall, I got everything here. Got all my documents, case files, and everything I need to kind of go through and retalk. Um, I guess if you're interested in any of this stuff more, a lot of the information for my answers I got is from this Natural Resources Law and Policy, third edition. This has been a huge resource for answering these questions, and yeah, so definitely don't think I'm the one that's doing the real hard research and learning all this stuff. A lot of this information that I'm going to be using to answer these questions was pulled from that book, as well as from lecture material with Professor Martin Nie. And if you're interested in learning more about natural resources, law, and policy, I'd highly recommend taking that course, NRSM 422 here at the University of Montana with Professor Nye. It's we're pretty just kind of scratched the surface so far, but I've really enjoyed. I found it really interesting. It's been enjoyable. But yes, I'm gonna walk through kind of this first exam study guide and just kind of read through some of the questions he's given out, or read through all the questions he's given out so far, and like I said, provide my answers, and then maybe definitely do a fair bit of rambling, and so yeah, I guess like I said, this is pretty much just for myself to try to listen to at work during the weeknights, just to get a little extra studying in before this exam. But if anyone else from NSRM 422 happens to stumble upon this, I don't I don't think I'll probably post this anywhere. But just for the sake of me being able to listen to it down the road, it might end up on my YouTube channel. Uh, but like I said, if anyone else from NSRM 422 happens upon this, please leave a comment or reach out and you know get tell me why I'm wrong, or correct me, and or let's have a discussion, because that definitely seems to be the best way to learn this material, is just talking about it and working through it and walking through it. But yeah, so apologies if you come upon this and think that it's going to be some fun video. This is not saying it's not interesting. It is really interesting stuff. It's really cool. And if you're into if you're looking into a future in natural resources, it's definitely really important stuff to know. And yeah, so I guess that being said, I'm probably just going to get started here. Behind me, I do got the document as well with with the questions and the answers. You can't really see it. I don't know how to adjust the lighting in here, so I'll probably just. I do got the physical paper copy here in front of me, and then like I said, I got all my cases and additional documents, the Constitution, and all sorts of stuff here piled up. Actually, I'm gonna grab something real quick. There's a podium, so I'm gonna put some of his documents on here. It might be a little easier, make them a little more accessible for me. And I also got the book here in front of me, but there will probably, like I said, there's a few questions I didn't, I came up on, and I might have just bumped past. I haven't spent a whole lot of time going back through. This is like my initial trial run through these questions. So I'm definitely going to have some arbitrary and capricious answers. So I guess I should just get started. I don't know what I'm rambling here. There's definitely going to be a lot of free balling and rambling today. But, okay, first question. Briefly describe two ways in which federal lands were historically disposed, and how how does the history of federal land disposition and retention help explain the crazy quilt of land ownership patterns in parts of Montana and in the American West? All right, so kind of going back into the book, especially really delved into this. Disposition era was essentially following the Revolutionary War until the retention era began, which I think was kind of more in the later 1800s, early 1900s, when the U.S. government decided to stop maybe selling as much land and kind of focus more on retaining land. So yeah, first and foremost, I think especially pertaining to that crazy quilt land ownership pattern of Montana and the American West, one thing that could really be attributed to that is the land grants to the railroads. Let's see, here I got my answer. 1850 was kind of when this started. The government subsidized the Illinois Central Railroad. Illinois, Alabama, and Mississippi got a 200-foot right-of-way and even-numbered sections of land for 6 sections on either side of the right-of-way. So the railroad, and then also got an additional 200-foot right-of-way on every 200-foot right-of-way, and every section numbered, every numbered section of land for 6 sections on either side of the railroad was given to the states. The states could sell the subsidized railroad, could sell that land to subsidize the railroad. The government retained the odd sections of land within those 6-section chunks on either side of the railroad. And this was kind of done because the federal government assumed that with construction of the railroad, this would drive up the value of the federal lands that they retained within those 6-section chunks on either side of the railroad. And this kind of continues. So 1862, Congress, to encourage competition of the Transcontinental Railroad, offered alternate sections of public land for 10 and then extended to 20 miles from each side of the railroad. So that starts to get to be a pretty good swath. When you got these railroads cutting across the country, especially through the western United States, you got these swaths where so they have the railroad, they construct the road. At one point, they're doing 10 miles on each side, then they expand it to 20, and they do, for some reason I couldn't find this. It has to be in there. I don't know if if the railroads got the even or the odd sections in those 10 or 20 mile swaths, but either way, the railroad in those 10 and 20 mile swaths of sections got either the odd or the even numbered, so it created that alternate, pattern, railroad, public, all the way out for 10 or 20 miles. And, the federal government did this for the same reason that they did it in 1850 with the Illinois Central. They figured, all right, construction of the railroad, that's going to increase that value of that federal land along the railroad, and we're going to be able to sell it and make a little more cash. And I don't know, to me it doesn't seem like a bad idea. I don't know, obviously it's created, a mess of problems today, but and then I guess I got a couple more examples here from the book about railroad grants. In 1864, the Northern Pacific was given alternate sections out 40 miles in territories and 20 miles in states on each side of the railroad. So instead of 10 and 20, they went from 20 in states to 40 sections in territories, which at that time, Montana would have been a territory, so they would have been giving out 40-mile, I guess theoretically that would be, I think it would be 80 miles total. If I say my diaphragm here is the railroad, so here's I guess my arms are the 80-mile swaths, and then they would get, alternate sections all throughout this, federal railroad, alternate sections of land. And I think I guess I should have probably preempted this by talking about the Jeffersonian survey system and how they established sections of land and townships. I guess I don't got that here. I do know I have that written down further in my notes, so I'll probably come back to it in a little bit and explain it in better detail, and I got it actually written down in my notes here in front of me. but yeah, that's kind of how I guess. Oh, by the end of the railroad grants in 1871, railroads had received 94 million acres of land. So when you think about it, that 94 million acres of alternating sections, I should, dang it, I wish there was a whiteboard in here. I should, I wish I could write it out or draw it out because my arms are not great for this. Let me see here. Maybe I do got a. It doesn't have it. That's a bugger. But when you think about it, those 94 million acres, they're not just big chunks, big chunks of land. It's a chunk of it's intermixed with chunks of federal or private land possibly as well, alternating. I guess kind of moving on from railroads, the United States government, there was a land grants to states. And this was mainly, a lot of this land was given to states in their enabling acts, which the Congress used enabling acts to authorize, it was an authorization of a state's submission into the Union. So it started kind of with Ohio in 1803, in which Ohio was allotted, when it was in its enabling act, was allotted one section in each township to generate income for schools and additional. It was also given some additional land for a seminary and 5% net proceeds from federal lands. Because the states don't get any tax revenue from the federal lands within the state's borders, so the government figured, okay, we'll give each state, or at least Ohio in this case, one section per township. Township consists of 36 sections, 6 by 6 square. So, and each section 16, was given to each township to generate income for schools. This would become known as what we know today as trust land, state trust lands. And then this kind of, the federal government continued this, but also as more states were admitted, like in California, starting with California in 1850, new states received 2 sections per township, and then with Utah in 1896, states would receive 4 sections per township. And there was also additional lands given out as well. I think it was, I don't have it in here, but Arizona was like a big case where they got their 4 sections per township, but then they also received a load of land for colleges. I think there was an insane asylum. There was a couple other. I want to say I do have that written down somewhere else in here. But I know Arizona they got those 4 townships, but they also got a ton of other land for additional uses. And then there was also, with land grants to states, there was also the Swamplands Act, which allowed states to select land that was unfit for cultivation. And a lot of states were able to kind of take advantage of this by using like seasonal timing, kind of the ambiguity of unfit for a cultivation really allowed states to sneak in there and kind of using the seasonal timing and ambiguity of that language. In the end, they were able to patent 80 million acres. And they kind of used, like, I think in the book, they kind of talked about some examples of how states would use seasonal timing, like, hey, come check out this land. Is definitely swampy and unfit for cultivation. And maybe, it was in the spring and there was a lot of rain. But there was definitely some sneakiness going on by the states there. And I think in the end, there was the 80 million acres that had been patented. There was a lot of court cases brought in return for the in litigation of the Swampland Act. And I think in the end, it ended up being some 63 million acres that would officially be patented to the states from the federal government. And a lot of this land would eventually be, changed and adapted for cultivation or, built up for use. And then there was, kind of moving on from land grants to states, there was land grants to settlers. And this one's pretty heavy. There's a lot to cover in this. There's a lot this book goes into. And honestly, with this one, I was having a little trouble kind of figuring out, like, how deep he wants us to go on this. But so I just kind of started from the beginning and at least got, like, the main acts and what they did. So I guess kind of, beginning here, well, I guess the idea of opening up the West by the federal government the idea was to generate revenue, promote settlement, and get development, and that began with the 1785 ordinance, which established a $1 per acre, 640 acre plots, which one section is 640 acres. Like I said, I really wish there was a whiteboard, or I should have made a slideshow for this. Might do that, but yeah, just explaining how the Jeffersonian survey system went, because that would really help lay some groundwork for some of these answers if you don't know what that is. But yeah, each section is 640 acres, 640 acre square plot, 1 square mile. But yeah, so anyway, yeah, the 1785 ordinance, $1 an acre, 640 acre plots. So that was, $640 for a plot, a homestead, I guess. It wasn't very successful. It was too steep. So Congress then passed acts in 1796, 1800, and 1804 that allowed for installation payments. Still not very successful. A lot of the people moving onto this land and just weren't paying off their loans. So 1820, Congress ends the credit, but they shrink the size of the minimum acre, the plot, to 80 acres. So it reduces the price to $80. Then in 1832, it's, an 80 acre thing still, that's pretty steep. 1832, the minimum shrunk to 40 acres and was sold at, the plots were sold at auction to the highest bidder at a minimum of $1.25 an acre. I don't know why I didn't write this down here. I don't know why I did that. Okay. Not that I'm using that at all, but for some reason I feel a little more professional having that up there. Okay, so that's kind of the first initial acts to getting people, like settlement act, federal land to people, to citizens. Then there's the 1830 Preemption Act, that it just applies to lands that are surveyed and auctioned, 160 acres at $1.25 per acre, and the person who claimed the land needed to prove that the land had been settled and cultivated. The act was then updated in 1841 to include all surveyed land that had not been auctioned, and then in 1862, all public land in the public domain was open to preemption claims. And I'm a bit fuzzy on the preemption claim, but I want to say it's claims made on land that people had settled or been on before like obviously here, like they could only have, with the initial 1830 Act, they could only make the claim for lands that had been surveyed and auctioned, and then eventually it was just surveyed, and then eventually it was just all public lands. Essentially, people who were on that land before the government made their way west. That's a poor way of saying it, but just at the bare bones, that's kind of what how those preemption acts work. Okay. Then we move on to the Homestead Act of 1862. This is kind of one of the big ones. I think this is one that's kind of covered, like I've heard of this one before taking this class. This provided that any family head or anyone over 21 and a U.S. citizen or expressed intent to become a citizen could enter 160 acres for cultivation. Free patent of the land was granted when fees were paid and provided evidence of living on the land for 5 years. So this one was kind of the big one. That's pretty, you don't have to pay. I think free patent of the land was granted. There were some fees apparently. I don't remember diving into what those fees were, but I think they were pretty unsubstantial compared to, the previous things of like $1 per acre, stuff like that. And so that was kind of, people got excited about that. But most of the good land, most of the really good, like, easier to cultivate and farmland had already been claimed pretty early on. Of like the Midwest, upper Midwest, that went pretty quick. So by this point, there was a lot of tough land, in the west, southwest that was still out there. And so this Congress, to get people to kind of move into that more unclaimed, harder to work, drier, just not as productive land, they passed the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, which offered 320 acres I think it was kind of the same base rules as the Homestead Act, but larger plot. In theory, a larger plot of land could a larger quantity of poorer quality land could support a family. I think that was kind of the reasoning with the increasing of the size. And this was implemented for Arizona, Colorado, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, Wyoming. And the lands were non-mineral, non-irrigable, and no timber. And this was also expanded. This was then expanded also to Idaho, Kansas, North Dakota, South Dakota, and California. I don't think this was super successful, especially since the lands were non-mineral, non-irrigable, and no timber. Then Congress also then passed the 1916 Stock Raising Homestead Act, which offered 640 acres, again, expanding the size of that plot with the same idea of like, all right, larger quantity of low quality lands will support families. Non-irrigable land, government retained the mineral rights, and then there was a commutation provision too with this 1916 Stock Raising Homestead Act that allowed an entryman to occupy land for 6 months and then purchase it at $1.25 an acre. So this kind of it bypassed some of the initial requirements of the original Homestead Act, and what this did essentially was allowed for a ton of fraud, and lumber and large big lumber companies and large stock operators were able to garner huge land holdings through the commutation provision. And so there was a lot of fraud kind of throughout the whole Homestead Acts. It was pretty loose, and that I think that's was definitely a huge issue. And in total, there were 285 million acres of land patented under the Homestead Act. Then there was following the Homestead Act, there was additional acts such as the Timber Culture Act of 1873. Settlers were allowed to claim an additional 160-acre section for planting and watering 40 acres of trees. I think this ended up resulting in another 10.8 million acres being taken out of the public domain and into the private hands. And this was definitely another one that there was quite a bit of fraud, I think, associated with. And then there was the Desert Land Act of 1877, 640 acres at $1.25 for people $1.25 per acre for people willing to irrigate within 3 years. Another one that quite a bit of fraud, I think, with, and also Timber and Stone Act, 1878. 160 acre plots for $2.50 an acre, $2.50 per acre, for lands that were unfit for cultivation but valued for timber and stone. There was the 1866 patent load claims. We're getting into some mining acts kind of here now. Patent load claims allowed all land within public domain to be purchased at $5 an acre, following local rules and customs and minimal investment in labor/improvements. And I think there was the patent load claims. That's like following a vein of ore. I can't remember now. So like I said, there's a couple of these I should have definitely written down with the kind of more details on that one. But this one was kind of replaced or followed up by the Placer Act of 1870, which allowed for $2.50 an acre, extended claim to all forms of deposit, exception of coarse or other rock in place. And then finally, we got the 1872 General Mining Act, which is still in play today. Anyone who finds valuable mining deposits, staked it, and complied with local notice and rules could claim it without paying. And that's kind of how those are kind of some of the. I know it only asked for 2 ways in which federal lands were historically disposed, but I think essentially what he'd probably be looking for here, and I'm gonna visit his office hours this week too after going through this and ask him if I'm on the right track with some of these or if I'm just way off the mark. But I think he's probably going to be looking for maybe not quite as detailed going into every single act, but definitely alright, what were the land grants to the railroads or land grants to states, land grants to settlers, and then kind of digging in at least somewhat to each of them. And I mean, yeah, all these acts got really contributed. Going back to that initial question, like how did this contribute to the crazy quilt of land ownership in the United States? Yeah, I mean, we got all sorts of stuff going on here. We got land going to settlers, land going to the railroads, land going to states, and especially, well, I think the railroad's probably the biggest contributor to this crazy quilt because it's that the way that the land was given out in the alternating sections, where you got, I guess, essentially all your railroad lands are all going to be connected, but only at the corner, kitty corner from each other, or diagonal. So you got a checkerboard. Using that term, the checkerboard. You got a checkerboard land ownership of a private railroad, United States, private railroad, United States, and so forth. And then you also, outside of those swaths from the railroads, wrong way, outside of those swaths from the railroads, you got maybe homesteader, claiming lands out here. And then you also got, in each township, you got a section of state, land given to each state for those trust lands. And then, intermixed with that, you still have the federal lands, public lands that are retained throughout all these acts. And then there's also, the homesteads that failed and the government reclaimed that land too, which is further kind of, contributed to this crazy quilt. All right, I think I spent quite a bit of time on that first one, so I'm going to keep moving and kind of just keep the ball rolling a little bit here. There's a lot of questions. All right, so moving on to this one here, second one. How does the history of railroad grants and the unlawful... There is kind of some, like, repeated questions, but, like, you'll get you'll see. How does the history of the railroad land grants and the Unlawful Enclosures Act help us understand two parts of the contemporary disputes about corner crossing and landlocked public lands? Okay, so here we go. Okay, so we're kind of digging into some hot button stuff here with this one for sure. But okay, so how does the history of railroad land grants and the Unlawful Enclosures Act of 1885 help us to understand two parts of the contemporary disputes about corner crossing and landlocked public lands? All right, so right off the bat, Unlawful Enclosures Act of 1885. No person by force, threats, intimidation, or by any fencing or enclosing, or any unlawful means shall prevent or obstruct any person from peacefully entering upon or establishing settlement or residence on any tract of public land under the public land laws of the United States. Okay, so there's a case, we kind of really went into. Well, there was the Wyoming corner crossing case, which is still kind of ongoing, but Canfield versus the U.S. So, in Canfield versus the U.S., well, I guess I'll just kind of dig in. I mean, like I mentioned in the previous question, those railroad grants, yet again, whiteboard would be kind of killer right now. I don't know if this computer has paint on it. I could do that. Anyway, I could use a paper and pen. The railroads established, those swaths given to the railroads that gave the alternating checkerboard pattern of private and public land kind of set up. So yeah, so like, you're gonna have private and public lands. Your public lands are gonna be only, or they're gonna be connected, but only diagonally at the corners. Same with the private lands. They might be, connected, but only diagonally at the corner. And some of those public lands might be completely isolated or landlocked on all sides by private sections. So in Canfield versus the United States, a landowner was able to block off thousands of acres of public land by placing fences on alternating sections of private land, effectively closing off the public land for his own use. And this was obviously, the Supreme Court found that this was unlawful underneath the Unlawful Closures Act of 1885. I don't have there's not a diagram of the fencing, but essentially, yeah. So he used the alternating checkerboard pattern to hit, so he only built fence. The only fence he built was on his private land, but he built it in a way that completely like wouldn't allow people to enter the public land adjacent to his private lands. And this is a problem that we still heavily are running into today with these alternating sections of private and public that result from the railroad land grants. I just lost my page here. Okay. But essentially, in the Wyoming corner crossing case today, so there's this checkerboard pattern as a result of the railroad grant, and some hunters had crossed diagonally. They were on public land and diagonally crossed into another section of public land. That was they diagonally crossed, but then there was where it met two sections of private land, and there was where they crossed, there was a little two posts and a little chain that went across that technically blocked off the ability to go across the corner from the public, between the public land diagonally. And so they used the post, they hopped it, and like I said, they went diagonally. So they never set foot or touched the private land, but they did pass above the airspace of it. So this is and like I said, this is still ongoing. I think it was ruled that they hadn't trespassed. There was no lawful trespass or anything like that. But then, there's the airspace, as were they trespassing on the airspace of the private land? It's still kind of ongoing at this point. But I feel like I'm kind of losing my train here on this one. Okay, so I've gone through Camfield, I've gone through the unlawful enclosures. But essentially, like all of this goes back to that checkerboard pattern. I mean, the alternating sections of private and public created by the Railroad Acts. The two parts of contemporary disputes about corner crossing and landlocked public land. So essentially, what that railroad checkerboard pattern did was create these chunks of public land that are only possible to be accessed via corner crossing diagonally from one section of public to another. You can't access it via a road or trail. So that's I guess that's kind of what my take is on that one. Briefly stated, moving on to the next one here. Briefly stated, what is a checkerboard? What is a checkerboard landscape, and how did it happen? Provide one example of a management issue or challenge associated with checkerboard. So we've kind of covered this. We've hit this one pretty hard in the first couple of questions, and I kind of dove into it on the last one. But a checkerboard landscape is an alternating land ownership pattern. In a pattern like this, an owner may potentially have two properties that only meet diagonally at the corner. Checkerboard patterns arose out of the disposition era of the U.S. public lands, largely from giving alternating sections to railroads within a given perimeter along a railway. The federal government retained the other sections in the hopes that their value would increase. So pretty much like I said, and it would really help too if my plan is to only listen to this anyway, but I guess if anyone would want to watch it, it would really help to probably just throw up a little diagram of this. Management issue that kind of arises out of this pattern is accessing those public lands that might be completely landlocked or isolated within, in between four sections of private, there's that one public section that is only accessible via the corners of other public land. And, it's the crossing and, corner crossing is, it's disputed, I guess, to say the least. And I guess that this checkerboard thing can also, go all the way back to the Jeffersonian survey system, which lands were surveyed and disposed in a 6 square mile township with with 36 1 square mile sections, originated out of New England in kind of the colonial era. All right, moving on. For what purpose are state trust lands to be managed? State trust lands, I kind of covered that earlier in land disposition, in the first question of the disposing of lands from the government to the state. State trust lands are to be managed just essentially to generate revenue for the support of schools and other public institutions in the state. I don't know if I got any more written on that. No, not really. That was a pretty short one. For what purpose are here we go. For what purpose are state trust lands to be managed? How did the states come to own this land, and how was it generally distributed? What is the most common and significant beneficiary of state trust land management? So I guess there's definitely a little bit of a repeat from the last question here. And I think he's going to use a mix of these questions on the exam. It's not going to be all these questions, but it's definitely going to be a mix of these questions. So state trust lands, like I said in the last one, are to be managed to generate revenue for schools. This can include leasing the land to private individuals. And state trust lands aren't always, in the sense of like public lands like we would think of like a Forest Service land or like a public park. That's not always the case, especially if they're leased out to an individual for agriculture or grazing, So I guess I'll kind of how did states come to own this land and how is it generally distributed? So kind of going back to that first question again, but for new states to be admitted into the Union, Congress had needed to authorize the admission with an enabling acts, negotiated how much public land the territory would receive after becoming a state. Ohio in 1803 kind of set the precedent with this, and they received one section of public land. Ohio in 1803 set the precedent and received one section of public land in every township, as well as additional lands for seminary and revenue share. A little bit of deja vu here, for profits of federal land. In new states that followed this suit until California in 1850, which received two sections, and then 1896, starting with Utah, states received four. States continued to receive the four sections, but also additional acreages for land for various other public institutions. Oh, here we go. Yeah, here I state Arizona ended up receiving 14% of the total land mass of Arizona as state trust lands. And this was, for public schools, colleges, insane asylums, etc., all sorts of public institutions. The most common and significant beneficiary of these state trust lands are public schools, or should be public schools at least. I think it was in class someone had mentioned, one of the four other forestry guys, that the federal government was trusting that the state land would be used for schools. I believe that's what he said. Sorry if I got that wrong. Why is most federal public land located in the western United States? Why is so much of this federal public land intermingled with state and private property? Briefly describe one management conflict or challenge that results from such intermixed ownership. All right, so kind of following like the Revolutionary War and the establishment of the United States, former colonies. I think like the original 13 colonies were their borders extended from all the way to the Mississippi River, essentially. Those original, the states. But there was in the book it kind of talks about how Maryland, there was some, I know Maryland got kind of screwed by this because they got Virginia. I don't know, either way they got, they didn't get that big chunk of western land. They had a state adjacent, they had the ocean, then them, and then there was a state right here that blocked them from getting a chunk all the way to the Mississippi. They didn't see it was fair, and it wasn't. So they wouldn't they wouldn't ratify the Articles of Confederation, I think. So then that kind of put pressure on the other states and put pressure on the, what would have been the Constitutional Convention? I think I'm kind of getting into the weeds there, but essentially all the states they ceded that land that would go from where their borders were when they were colonies to the Mississippi River. They ceded that to the federal government, and then the federal government would use that to pay off Revolutionary War debts. And I think they also had promised land to veterans of the Revolutionary War. I might be getting some of that wrong, but I think that's kind of the gist of that. Yeah, these lands, also kind of going back to the Homestead Act, these lands in the East and Midwest, definitely a more favorable climate, better soil, just easier you could sustain a family on a lot less acreage in Illinois than you could in Nevada or North Dakota or South Dakota or Eastern Montana. But so that, less acreage required. And so these lands were patented, homesteaded and much more, easily and able to be claimed. And people were definitely more willing and, wanting to claim this land. Yeah, and like I said, the tracts of land in the West, they required more acreage and more work to support a homestead. Yeah, and then I kind of moving on here. So I guess that's, I think that definitely probably is a big attributor to why land in the East went so quickly, is because, it's a lot more favorable. It's not as much work, not a lot. I'm not saying it was easy, but yeah, more favorable climate for settling. And then kind of moving on here, so kind of moving on to why are the federal public lands intermingled with private property. I definitely, I kind of dive back into railroad grants here, that alternating checkerboard, has resulted in a lot of federal public lands being directly mixed in with privately owned railroad land and lands that would be sold to private individuals eventually. Then there was the state enabling acts, which I covered in the last question, which, states were granted sections and additional land for schools to generate revenue per township. And then there was the various homestead and preemption acts, where settlers were able to claim sections of federal public land in the West in return for payment or for fulfillment of certain actions. So people were moving into federal public lands and claiming that up, and I think that also kind of ties in with why there's more land in the West. People took advantage of those acts in the Midwest and the Central and Midwest, especially. Yeah, I guess so. I think we're kind of moving into the management. Briefly describe one management conflict or challenge resulting from such intermixed ownership. So yeah, when it comes to the landlocked sections of the public land, where you've got that, either private or the railroad owned lands, and then you got that one section of federal in the middle of all of them, surrounded on all the four sides by private land except for adjacent to it diagonally or kitty corner. When it comes to those landlocked sections of public land, accessing that land is a huge issue, and that, and the private landowner, they're not legally allowed to enclose, they couldn't build a fence that would block people from getting into that public land. But so you would have, the only way you could get into that section, it would be diagonally crossing from one public section to the next. But by doing so, you're going to enter the airspace of the private individual, and this is where a lot of issues arise. The legality of that, and it's still debated pretty hotly. But so yeah, you can't, and I guess from a management standpoint, you got that section of public land there, and you can't access it. How are you gonna get to it to do what you need to do? You're surveying it, checking it out, doing fuels mitigation, fire stuff. It's managing wildlife on that section. It's tough. And then you got people, hunters and stuff crossing into that land diagonally, and then private individuals take them to court over trespassing claims. It's definitely some pretty big management issues can arise from that. Just accessing that land is a big issue. Okay, here we go. How does Cleffy versus New Mexico, 1976, help us to understand the powers derived from the property clause of the U.S. Constitution? What does this have to do with federal lands and wildlife management? All right, so right off the bat here, I got the property clause from the Constitution. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. Okay, and kind of one of the key, some of the key words in that phrase there is to make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. I think I kind of go into CLEPI a little bit here. Okay, so CLEPI, I mean, broad strokes from just bare memory here. Well, it's also tied in with the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act of 1971 so this was passed by Congress, and essentially it was to protect all unbranded and unclaimed horses and burros on public lands of the United States from capture, branding, harassment, or death. Provides that all such horses and burros on public lands administered by the Secretary of Interior through the BLM or Secretary of Ag through the U.S. Forest Service are committed to the jurisdiction of the respective secretaries, who are directed to protect and manage components of public lands in a manner that is designed and achieve and maintain a thriving natural ecological balance of the public lands. I guess what happened in CLEPI was essentially there was a landowner who was leasing some BLM land for grazing, and one day he sees, I think it was 19 burros out on that land, and apparently the claim was that they were kind of harassing his cattle. So he contacted the BLM, and they said, hey, it's on BLM land. We're not, we're gonna let him be and let him hang out there. But then the state of New Mexico, they got there's the New Mexico estray law, and that pretty much the estray law, I think was, I don't know, I don't think I actually have it here, but essentially, yeah, they would, under this law, they would take those free roaming horses and burros, collect them and then sell them at auction, especially if they were being a nuisance, I think, like in this case. So we contacted them, and the Livestock Board of New Mexico came in and removed the burros from federal land and sold them at auction. And then, so the BLM came in, they demanded that the burros be recovered and returned. And I guess under the Wild and Free Roaming Horses Act, Congress had kind of deemed the animals, the horses and burros, as an integral part of the natural system of public lands. And the property clause of the Constitution gives Congress power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or property of the United States. So the property clause gives Congress jurisdiction over federal lands within state borders. And the burros were on federal public lands, and the implementation of the Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act was needful because the animals had been deemed an integral part of the ecosystem. So, kind of going back to the property clause here, okay, back to the original question. How does CLEPI versus New Mexico help us to understand the powers derived from the property clause of the U.S. Constitution? What does this have to do with federal lands and wildlife management? I want to jump into federal preemption, or the supremacy clause, but I don't know if that's really what he's looking for here. Because the property clause essentially gives Congress, allows Congress to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. So they have the constitutional power under this clause to make all rules that are needful regarding, public lands. So, they saw that the Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act was needful because they saw free roaming horses and burros as a integral part of the ecosystem. So there, I guess, I don't know, that's kind of how I guess my chain of thought going from the property clause to the Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. And so that kind of is what gives Congress the power to make that rule over the free roaming horses and burros. Because like I said, I would say the supremacy, I would go into the supremacy clause, because that also plays a pretty big part in here, but he's not asking about that. He's just asking about the property clause. And there was also another case in regards to there was a whitetail along the Grand Canyon in New Mexico, and the Forest Service's right to make rules to hunt, to take those whitetail out, even though without the state's discretion. But like I said, that kind of gets into the supremacy clause, and I don't think that's what he's looking for there. The U.S. Constitution's property clause, the Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. How does the property clause help us understand the limitations presented to those states seeking the transfer of federal land to state ownership? Provide an example of a property clause power used by Congress and interpreted by the Supreme Court. I think this is one that I didn't answer. Yeah, because this one maybe I'm just not very good with the property clause. No, it's definitely, part of it. But how does the property clause help us to understand the limitations presented to states seeking transfer of federal land to state ownership? See, that part's got me a bit puzzled. How does the property... That's one I might just have to consult him on a little bit when I go in as office hours. I think that's what I'm going to do there. I might keep buzzing by. Might come back around to that one. We'll see. All right. What part of the U.S. Constitution provides Congress the authority to enact the Unlawful Closures Act of 1885? What is the basic purpose? I may have to go get a drink of water here. I am dying. The property clause... Okay. What part of the U.S. Constitution provides Congress the authority to enact the Unlawful Enclosures Act of 1885? What is the basic purpose of this act? So, the property clause of the U.S. Constitution provides Congress the authority to enact the Unlawful Enclosures Act. The basic purpose of the Unlawful Enclosures Act is to prohibit any entity or from exclusive use or occupancy of public lands by enclosing the land with construction or of a barrier or threat. Okay, that's kind of that one. That one's pretty straightforward. I don't know how to dig into that one more. In a nutshell, what is the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution, and how would it help resolve a case involving a federal law in conflict with a state law? So this is kind of where I wanted to dig in a little bit on the property clause one a couple back, but I held off because I wasn't sure if that was really what he was looking for. But, so, I mean, a big example would be the Kleppe versus New Mexico, but the Supremacy Clause establishes that the Constitution, laws made from it, and treaties made are the supreme law of the land. Supreme law of the land. When it comes to cases of state law versus federal law, the federal law will supersede the state law on federal lands. So, I guess, I'm trying to think of, an example. I mean, I guess it's super, okay, the Kleppe versus New Mexico. So there's the Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. It superseded the New Mexico Estray Law. The New Mexico Estray Law was, we'll round these stray horses up and we'll sell them at auction. The Horses and Burros Act, made by Congress, the federal law, was no, the horses are an integral part of the ecosystem. We're gonna let them be, leave them be out there. That's a pretty simple way of saying it, but that law, under the Supremacy Clause, is the supreme law of the land, supreme law of the federal land, and therefore it superseded the state law of the New Mexico's estray laws. And while states are entitled to enforce their laws and regulations on federal lands within their borders, federal law still supersedes these state laws. Okay, and we'll kind of get into this a little more with the treaty too as well. So, Article 3 of the Hellgate Treaty of 1885 governs the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. It reads, "The exclusive right of taking fish in all streams, and all the streams running through or bordering said reservation is further secured to said Indians, as also the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places, in common with citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary buildings for curing, together with the privilege of hunting, gathering roots and berries, and pasturing their horses and cattle upon open and unclaimed land." What two parts of the U.S. Constitution help us to understand the legal basis of this clause, and what does it have to do with federal public lands and or fish and wildlife management? All right, so the two clauses or two parts of the U.S. Constitution, at least from what I was looking at, that help us to understand the legal basis of this this is the Supremacy Clause and the Treaty Clause. The Treaty Clause, so here's kind of the gist of the Treaty Clause. The Treaty Clause gives the President, with Senate advice and consent, power to make treaties, 2/3 Senate vote. To make treaties, that's in the Constitution. Treaty is a legally binding agreement between two or more sovereign nations. And then the Supremacy Clause establishes treaties as supreme law of the land, which means they supersede state law. So reserved treaty rights will supersede state rights. So this treaty, the Salish and Kootenai, the Hellgate Treaty, it was signed between two sovereign nations, the United States and the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, through power given to the President in the Treaty Clause. In signing the treaty, the tribes reserved the right described in Article 3 of the treaty in exchange for the land to the United States. So the Salish Kootenai essentially, I guess, I'm sorry if this is probably an incentive to, but they gave up that land. In exchange, though, they reserved those rights as mentioned in that clause, which I just read, the hunting and fishing on lands, and then also, the hunting, gathering roots, berries, and pasturing their horses upon open and unclaimed land, which will kind of come up here. And so, okay, I think, so I just finished, Article 3 of the treaty in exchange for land to the United States. The Supremacy Clause ensures that the treaty and the rights it reserves for the tribe on their land and all open and unclaimed land are the supreme law of the land. The interpretation of open and unclaimed land was determined to include Forest Service land by the Montana Supreme Court in 1977. So, this means that, members of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe can continue to reserve these rights on Forest Service land today. Under the Supremacy Clause, the reserved rights of the treaty supersede the state regulations towards those resources. So I guess this would, a simple example here. Essentially, members of the, tribal members of the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe are able to hunt, they're under, with the reserved rights from the treaty, that was, the treaty was legally the right to make a treaty was legally given to the President under the Constitution. Tribal members are able to hunt deer on Forest Service lands out of, maybe, and they can do this outside of maybe the Montana state hunting season. And the Supremacy Clause means that, the tribal members, that those treaty rights to hunt on that land supersede the Montana state hunting regulations or the seasons. That's kind of how I kind of broke it down there. So yeah, the Treaty Clause gave the President the authority to sign that treaty with the Senate Council and then 2/3 vote. The Supremacy Clause made that treaty supreme law of the land. So that means that the rights reserved in the treaty supersede the state rights. How does an administrative rule and regulation differ from a statute? Where are the I gotta get something to drink real quick. I'll be right back. I gotta get some water. Hold on, 2 minutes. Okay. I needed that. I was kind of dying, or not dying. Dying's a huge exaggeration, but I was thirsty. That's at least. What time are we running? Oh, geez, it's about 4 o'clock already. Oofda. Okay. So moving on to the next one. How does an administrative rule or regulation differ from a statute? Where are statutes and regulations codified? All right. So a statute is legislative and are written and passed into law by Congress. An administrative rule or regulation are executive and they're written by federal agencies. The agencies take the statutes written by Congress and fill in the details, or the agencies interpret ambiguous language in the statute and write laws to interpret this language. Regulations made by agencies are done through the Administrative Procedure Act and are put under judicial review before being codified. Statutes are codified in the U.S. Code, and regulations are found in the Code of Federal Regulations. Okay. How does an administrative rule or regulation differ from a statute? That's the part I don't know why I paused there. Where are the statutes and regulations codified? Why does rulemaking, the writing of regulations, generally happen? So I kind of went through this in the last one, but like I said, administrative rule is written by agencies in the executive branch. These rules are made through the Administrative Procedure Act, and statutes are kind of the broad framework legislation written and passed by Congress. Regulations are written because Congress often doesn't answer all the questions in statutes passed. These statutes may contain ambiguous language, such as like multiple use from the Forest Management Act, I think. But ambiguous language like multiple use that needs to be further interpreted by agencies through their own laws. Agencies need to enforce statutes, and it's easier to do that when they're maybe a little more focused on certain things. The use of this ambiguous language is Congress's way also deferring to the expertise of agency officials. Before an agency can enforce statutes with ambiguity, they must define and publish it so the public can comply to it. Deferring to that agency expertise is, I think, kind of a big component of it too. All right, so let's see. As discussed in class, the National Forest Management Act includes a provision related to wildlife. Forest plans shall provide for diversity of plant and animal communities based on the sustainability and capability of the specific land area in order to meet the overall multiple use objectives. So there's that multiple use again. And then also, you got provide for diversity of plant and animal communities. That's pretty ambiguous language throughout that whole thing. But, all right, so then here he goes. Describe the general process pursuant to the Administrative Procedure Act, APA of 1946, that was used to write the U.S. Forest Service diversity regulations. Why were these regulations necessary? On what legal basis could the agency's regulations pertaining to diversity be challenged by outside interests? Okay, so I'm just going to start right off with the process, the general process pursuant to the APA that the Forest Service would use to write diversity regulations. So this is the rulemaking format they use is commonly known as rule and comment, or notice and comment. So the first step of the APA process requires public notice of this. Would require public notice of the Forest Service. This is new diversity regulations. This is done. Notice of the public is done by publishing the proposed regulations in the Federal Register, and the Federal Register, essentially from kind of the book, but I think the way kind of described it as is essentially the federal government's daily newspaper of announcements, notices, and rules. So they'll publish the proposed regulations in that, so public can look at it, get an idea, read them, and then just give notice to the interested parties. And then also I guess the second part of the APA process is public participation. So that within that Federal Register notice, there will also be location and time of public hearings, and then I think there's also with the online Federal Register, they can also there's probably a comment, not like a comment section on YouTube, but a way to submit public comments on the regulations. But yeah, so essentially, the public participation is the second step in the APA process, and also why it's known as the notice and comment rulemaking. Provide notice and allow for comment. This allows for the public and others to provide input, not just like the general public, but other agencies, or could also provide comment to, say, Forest Service is looking at putting in some regulation pertaining to something, and then maybe someone from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service sees it, and then they see maybe they have a possible concern. They could also provide comment as well. And then also, these public comments, or these comments will be addressed. They might address them in the rulemaking, but they're also, a lot of these comments will be addressed in the final publishing, and the response from as to why maybe they didn't change that, or how they addressed that comment as well. Well, could be published in the final publishing of the regulation. And then the third step in the APA process is judicial review. This stage is kind of to hold the federal agencies accountable. The reviewing court shall hold unlawful and set aside agency actions, findings, and conclusions found to be arbitrary and capricious, abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with the law. So just a little quick definition here: arbitrary, based on random choice or personal whim, rather than reason, and capricious, subject to whim, given to sudden and unaccountable changes of mood and behavior. So I guess I actually wrote up a little example here of maybe something that you would like, that I would consider arbitrary and capricious, at least. Maybe you would too. So let's say I read, okay, let's jump ahead. Let's fast forward let's jump ahead 5 months, 6 months from now. So it's February or March, and I read a fishing report for Hauser Reservoir stating that people are catching lots of lingcod, rigging cut sucker on the bottom at night. People are pulling them up, they're getting good ones. The bite's hot. They're spawning, they're moving into the shallower water. So I go there, and I decide to tie on a 1/16 ounce jig head tipped with a maggot. And I work the upper water column, around 2 in the afternoon. And my goal is, I'm not targeting trout or perch. I'm hoping to catch burbot. So my decision here, my action and decision in this scenario would be arbitrary and capricious. There's no rational connection between the facts found and my decision to run. There's no rational connection between me reading the report that says, they're catching lots of burbot using cut sucker right on the bottom, at night, and I decide, I'm going to go there at 2 in the afternoon and fish a 1/16 ounce jig head 2 feet below the ice. There's no connection between those two. There's a clear error in my judgment, obviously, like what? Yeah, I don't know, like what? Yeah, there's just an error in my judgment on that scenario. It's not, I don't know. Not really sure why I'd make that decision. And then, obviously an important aspect being ignored in my decision, burbot, they're similar to catfish in their feeding style. I don't know why I'm going off into the weeds here, but, I wouldn't go fish for, catfish or something using a little jig head through the ice. So, I just ignored, the important aspect ignored in my decision is the common feeding habit of burbot, feeding at night and usually going for those, that stinky chunk of cud bait. Not that you wouldn't catch one on a jig head. It's not, I wouldn't rule it out. That's it. Again, aside from the point, but it'd be arbitrary and capricious, especially after reading the fishing report. But anyway, so definitely just a little example there of arbitrary and capricious. I thought at least that kind of helps me think about it a little bit, especially like the 3 questions afterwards, rational connection between facts found and decision, clear error in my judgment, and important aspect ignored in my decision. Okay, so I'm still continuing on with the question, but anyways, so the federal courts, they review in the judicial review, the courts review agency interpretations of laws and statutes. Are the rules or agency actions arbitrary and capricious? Agency actions and decisions done pursuant to these laws and regulations, are the actions arbitrary and capricious? And like, if you want another good example of arbitrary and capricious, like actual legally defined as arbitrary and capricious, Spotted Owl versus Hotel. I think I go into it a little bit further in a later question, so I'm not going to dive into it now. But that's pretty. I mean, that's the literally textbook case for it. And formally, okay, this is new, but the Chevron doctrine had been kind of used as the precedent for determining if an agency action was arbitrary and capricious. And it was very deferential to agencies. And it pretty much deferred to agency expertise in the case of like interpreting a statute or by Congress. And it just kind of it begins with, is the statute, the first question you ask in the Chevron 2-step, I don't know the dance, but is the statute ambiguous or silent on the question? If no, the agency must follow the statute. Obviously Congress wrote that statute then very specific. The agency has to follow it. If yes, and if they answered yes to this question, is the statute ambiguous or silent on the question? Generally, then it was deferred to the agency. The agency had a high success rate, not 100%, but they had a high success rate of things going their way, of being deferred to. But anyways, yeah, if yes, the court defers to the, or if yes, they ask, was the agency interpretation of the statute reasonable? And generally, the court would defer to it. And if yes, the court defers to agency expertise. If no, the action and interpretation of the agency is arbitrary and capricious. But anyway, under Chevron, courts were very deferential to agencies' interpretations and agency expertise. But this has all been kind of scrapped out the window over the past couple months now with Loper v. Bright. I'll go into that probably in a later question as well. And then, so there were some further questions that are considered when finding an agency action and decision arbitrary and capricious. And I dug into these with my Burbid example earlier. But is there a rational connection between the facts found and the decision made? Is there a clear in judgment of the agency, and was there an important aspect or problem of the problem and issue not considered by the agency? These are all things that a court's going to look at when finding an agent. Consider when finding an agency arbitrary and capricious. And with these three things, it really shows the importance of good record keeping, because then the agency can then show their line of thought of how they came to these decisions that might be considered arbitrary and capricious. But if they can show, like, oh no, we have our experts found this, this, and this, here's our record of it, here's how we came to this conclusion, then that might could help. That definitely will help their case. Okay. And like I said, the Chevron 2-step, like I talked a little bit about earlier, that was overruled. So that's kind of, the judicial review process is definitely a little bit of uncharted waters right now. A little Loper v. Bright pun there, I guess. Okay, what else was in the question? Okay, let's see. Where are we? On what? Okay. Where? Okay, so we explained that. Why were these regulations necessary? These regulations are necessary so that the Forest Service can enforce the statutes written by Congress. Without the regulations in place, diversity is very broad, and land managers in the agency would have a difficulty laying out consistent objectives. So it's like that really broad term's hard to enforce, and I don't know, I think it also, if they can write more specific regulations to these broad statements, that also helps the public know, what they're legally allowed to do and what not to do. So I think that was kind of how I viewed answering that question. And all right, and then I guess last part, on what legal basis could the agency's regulations pertaining to diversity be challenged by outside interests? So yeah, an outside interest could definitely challenge these regulations on the basis that they might be arbitrary and capricious, and maybe they don't see how the Forest Service came to the decision that they did in regards to the diversity regulations. So they could definitely challenge it on that basis, and they would have to undergo judicial, go through the courts, and that's where that rule, that record keeping and would definitely come up big for them to show that the rational connection between the facts found and their decision made. There wasn't a clear error in judgment, and was there important, how did they consider those important aspects and stuff like that. So yeah, that was kind of how I approached that one. That's another one I might ask him about too, just to be 100%, because I don't know if I answered that last part really well. What is the judicial... Oh, here we go, a little bit of deja vu again. Losing my voice. What is the judicial review provision of the APA of 1946? What does it mean when people say this is a deferential standard of review? What does statutory ambiguity have to do with this? Does this mean that federal agencies cannot be held accountable for their actions and decisions? Please explain with a real or hypothetical example. So the judicial review provision of the APA, like I just said, courts shall, in the judicial review provision of the APA, courts shall compel agency action unlawfully withheld or unreasonably delayed. That one, honestly, I've kind of had a little trouble fully fleshing that out. For some reason, I don't know, that's one I might actually ask him about. I got a highlighter. Yeah, I don't know. For some reason that, I have trouble understanding exactly what that means. I don't think we really talked about that much in class. I don't think it's super important, not as important as the second part. But, and then, yeah. Hold unlawful and set aside agency action findings and conclusions found to be arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion or otherwise not in accordance with the law, contrary to the constitutional right, power, privilege, or immunity, in excess of statutory jurisdiction without observance of procedure required by law. That's kind of like NEPA. That would be, and a NEPA would be an example. Maybe they didn't file an EIS or something when they committed a major federal action. Okay, so that's kind of, that's the judicial review provision. And I went into Chevron a bit on the last one, but that's not really a thing anymore. So I don't really know if I should dig into that. Kind of what I'll ask him about, if he still wants us to really dig into that kind of question or not. Judicial review is referred to as deferential because it is kind of a limited inquiry. That's definitely some language from the book. But it's a limited scope. It only looks at a kind of a small, narrow. The court's role is only to ensure that the agency hasn't acted in an arbitrary and capricious way. It's not its role isn't to substitute its judgment for agency expertise. They're trying to find, make sure that the agency had, reason to make the decision they did. Statutory ambiguity, it plays a hand in this because Congress often, writes statutes with ambiguous language such as multiple use or ecosystem services. The ambiguity of this language kind of allows language, agencies to further define these terms and their regulations more specifically, address these things in more detail and fill in the gaps kind of left by them. While this historically is meant court will defer to agency expertise, that's not always the case. And here's the, I guess, so answering the last part with the hypothetical or the real example. Does this mean federal agencies can still be held accountable for their actions and decisions, and that directly Spotted Owl versus Hodel, which I mentioned earlier. So just a little brief cover on Hodel, Spotted Owl. Due to logging in the Pacific Northwest, spotted owl populations were, significantly reduced due to loss of old growth habitat. So, in 1987, or under the Endangered Species Act, the Secretary of Interior, is to determine whether any species have become extinct or endangered. That's required. So in 1987, the Fish and Wildlife Service announces that they're going to do a review of spotted owl for listing, and they requested public comment. They conduct the review. They have a group. They bring together a group of scientists, and then they got their expert, Dr. Mark Schaefer, who was an expert on population viability, and they come to the conclusion that, I'll quote him here. This is Dr. Mark Schaefer's quote. The most reasonable interpretation of current data and knowledge indicate continued old-growth harvesting is likely to lead to the extinction of the subspecies in the foreseeable future, which argues strongly for listing the subspecies as threatened or endangered at this time. Not sure why I did a voice there. But anyway, so yeah, he kind of says, like, it's not looking good for old spotted owl, northern spotted owl. They're on the way out if we keep this up. So, in a peer review too, they peer review it, and a number of other experts agree with his conclusion. They conclude the status review. They complete the status review, and on December 14th, 1987, and they conclude that it's not warranted to list the owl. They decide, despite the expert and peer review saying that it's not looking good, they decide we don't need to list them. And then kind of following this, the suit follows, and courts find the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's decision to be arbitrary and capricious. Due to the lack of, the Fish and Wildlife Service didn't provide any connection between how they got to their decision not to list, and they didn't provide like expert analysis. They did what they weren't supposed to. They didn't. Yeah, I think the biggest thing was that they didn't provide that connection between how they came to their decision to not list the spotted owl. So the court remanded Fish and Wildlife Service, and they had 90 days to provide analysis. And they forced them to redo the review. So even if it is a deferential, court, a deferential review, it doesn't mean that, agencies are free, to do whatever they want. They're still gonna, especially like, I don't reckon it was probably a lack of record keeping that they couldn't make that connection. I don't know. I'm not sure. We didn't really talk about how they came to that conclusion. Nobody knows, I guess. Probably some money or something. I don't know. That's speculation. Briefly describe one implication that may result from a public land law that is written by Congress in a relatively vague and open-ended fashion. Potential implication from a vague or open-ended statute is that when there's a change in the executive branch, so say a new president is elected with different ideas on how things should be run, and they bring in a new cabinet, so this means new secretaries of interior, head of the USDA, stuff like that. And so the interpretation of the statute by the agencies might change, and this will lead to a new direction. The new direction may lead to changing the interpretation of ambiguous terms in the such as multiple use in the CFR. So it's like when we talked in class, it's pendulum swings. One agencies may be more focused on protecting environmental sustainability, and preserving lands and keeping them open to the public, but then maybe a new person comes in, they have new ideas, they want to promote drilling or resources, promote making some money on the land, so they're gonna the pendulum's gonna switch, they're gonna put different people in charge, and the goals of the agency are gonna change. And so when Congress leaves this vague and open-ended language, that means all those regulations by the by the agency are going to change. It's a lot of change. It can be change. There can be a lot of change in an agency with that in regulations with that open-ended language when a new head comes in. I think I kind of explained that poorly, but all right, here we go. Use northern spotted owl versus Hodel to explain the arbitrary and capricious standard of judicial review, and explain the 2 to 3 questions the court asks in determining whether an agency action is arbitrary and capricious. Okay, so I kind of dove into this with with spotted owl earlier, but on also my little burbot example. But in northern spotted owl versus Hodel, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decision not to list this northern spotted owl as an endangered species was brought under judicial review. In reviewing the species, Dr. Schaefer and a group of biologists concluded that the species was likely to become extinct in the foreseeable future, and argued strongly for the species to be listed as threatened or endangered at the time. In determining that the Fish and Wildlife Service decision was arbitrary and capricious in its decision not to list the northern spotted owl, they ask several questions. Is there a rational connection between the facts found and the decision made? In this case, northern spotted owl, the courts didn't see a connection between conclusion and by the scientists and the decision made by the agency. The service didn't provide any analysis to support its conclusion and asserted that it is entitled to make its own decision. So they didn't provide any analysis to support that decision. And then they might also ask, is there a clear error in judgment of the agency, and was there an important aspect of the problem or issue not considered by the agency? These two I was kind of having trouble applying to northern spotted owl, because I think the biggest thing is the rational connection between their decision not to list the species and what the scientists said. Reading the case, they did provide some empirical data, but no analysis. I guess I would say it was probably a clear error in judgment. To not list it, in spite of what the scientists said. The biologists and the scientists they brought in said. And an important aspect of the problem or issue not considered by the agency. I don't know. This one I wasn't really sure either how to connect with this. That was one I was definitely going to ask him about in office hours. I'm going to highlight that real fast. Okay, and this is why I kind of rounded it off with saying, this is why that record keeping, to show your work on how you arrived at that conclusion. And that's one thing we talked about in lecture quite a bit, is just showing your work, just to prove how you got from point A to point B. And they didn't really do that. They had the scientists say one thing, and then they came to here, but they didn't provide, maybe what they found differently from the scientists to prove, their decision. And so that was kind of how I broke that one down. Put simply, 1 to 2 sentences, what was the Chevron doctrine, and how was it applied by the courts to a federal agency's interpretation of a law in a rule or regulation? So the Chevron doctrine, aka the Chevron two-step, was used by courts in the judicial review phase. The doctrine established that if a statute was ambiguous or silent on an issue, the courts had to defer to the expertise of the agency in most cases. That's short and sweet on that one. How does the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, 2024, change the amount of discretion generally afforded to federal agencies by the judiciary? What branch of government does this empower? Alright, so the decision eliminates the Chevron doctrine. Going forward, courts aren't gonna, it's no longer gonna be in play, I guess. Courts are, in terms of, deferring to, they don't have to defer anymore if it's just because a statute's ambiguous, essentially. So it's gonna it's gonna reduce the amount of deference given to federal agencies by the judiciary, and then in turn it gives more power to the judiciary. It gives the courts power to interpret ambiguity in statutes, and they no longer they don't have to defer on grounds of ambiguity anymore. So definitely, gives some more power to the Supreme Court. Let's see. Oh, he says there's going to be another Loper v. Bright question there. In a nutshell, what is NEPA scoping? On page. Okay. NEPA scoping. Determining whether a federal action is major and significantly affects the environment. Kind of encompasses, it encompasses connected and cumulative actions. Connected actions are actions that are automatically triggered by an agency action actions that are automatically triggered by an agency action that otherwise might appear minor. And cumulative actions are actions that may be individually minor, but when taken together have cumulatively significant impacts. And I got a little example here from the book. So there's a 20-mile road segment example. A 20-mile road would definitely, have a significant impact on the environment. But say you took, you proposed 21-mile segment roads. So like a 1-mile segment road definitely won't, isn't going to have near the significant impact that a 20-mile road would have. So, you must ask, it says, you got to ask whether they have independent utility or if connected. Does one of those, does road segment along mile 16 make no sense without 15 and 17? If it's, that doesn't make any sense. Then the segments must be together, and therefore it's a cumulative action. And there was an example from the book too. I think it was in the Idaho National Forest, and I lost it here. But either way, they essentially tried to do this, or they did something similar to avoid having to do environmental impact statements and just do environmental assessments. So they wanted to build a logging road in order to access like 3 logging units, but they broke it apart. So they said, oh yeah, the road alone isn't going to have a significant impact. So they just did an environmental assessment. They determined that they only needed an environmental assessment for the road. Then after they did the road, they did separate environmental assessments for the individual logging units, connected only possible from the construction of the road. But they determined that the units themselves wouldn't have a significant impact, even though cumulatively all those things together would have a significant impact on, I think there was like a gray wolf population and some other stuff too, but on the environment in general. And so therefore, they got in some trouble for that one. That was, because they were connected actions or cumulative actions, but they tried segmenting it up. But anyways, NEPA scoping is determining whether an action is major and significant. How is the principle of precaution, to look before you leap, integrated into the design of NEPA, and how is it implemented by federal land agencies? Please discuss Section 102 of the law in your answer. Oh, here we go, NEPA. The principle of precaution is integrated into NEPA via the requirement of agencies to list potential side effects of their action, potential alternatives to the action, and the mitigation techniques they can implement to reduce side effects of their action. And I should mention that all those things are found in an environmental impact statement. So NEPA requires EISs if it's a major federal action, and the EIS will have all those things in it. So it's definitely making the agency take a hard look and, at what would be the result of what they do. Think before you're doing it, for sure. And then, like, Section 102 of NEPA, that's where you really find this. And here, I'll just kind of quote it. Section 102 of NEPA requires agencies to provide an EIS, environmental impact statement, for major federal actions. And then Section 102, that's where you find pretty much all this information about the requirements of an EIS and when an EIS is required. But it lists what must be required in the EIS, environmental impact of the action, environmental effects that cannot be avoided during the action, a range of alternative actions, and the potential environmental impacts that those alternatives pose, relationship between short-term uses of man's environment and the maintenance of and enhancement of long-term productivity. That one I was a little bit tripped up on. And any irreversible and irretrievable commitments of federal resources which would be involved in the proposed agency action should it be implemented. Yeah, okay. By addressing this list of an EIS, the agency becomes aware and informed that all of the potential of environmental effects of their potential action and its alternatives. So, yeah, that's kind of the look before you leap theory. Why is it said that NEPA is procedural law? What does it have to do with Section 101, Section 102, Section 105? The role of the courts interpreting NEPA. This is another one I bypassed for the time being. I'll probably come back to it. I might ask him a little bit more about that one too when I visit his office hours. Let's do a little highlight action real quick. Okay. It is crazy how much your throat dries out doing this. All right, what does it mean when people say that NEPA is procedural law? NEPA is referred to as a procedural law because NEPA does not require a substantive result. I don't know why I'm having trouble with that. But essentially, if an agency properly completes the NEPA process and considers the EIS, NEPA doesn't require the agency to choose the environmental preferable action. As long as the agency does the steps that it needs to, that's it. They're good to go. The thing is that they do the steps and do the steps they need to, as far as NEPA is concerned, at least. Yeah, NEPA isn't like it's not gonna force, it's not, it doesn't require a substantive result. It just requires that the agency completes the NEPA process. Like I mentioned in the last one, it's just to make sure that they consider the effects of their potential action before they do it. Sorry, I'm trying to turn off the projector because I haven't used it at all. All right. So, okay, here we go. Next question. Other statutes may impose substantive environmental obligations on federal agencies, but NEPA merely prohibits uninformed rather than unwise action. Explain what the Supreme Court means by this statement, as found in Robertson v. Meadow Valley Citizen Council. What does it have to do with Section 105 of NEPA? Does this mean that NEPA is an insignificant law? Essentially, this is saying that if an agency has properly followed the NEPA procedure and completed an EIS in full, NEPA does not require the agency to take a particular action in regards to the effects it may have on the environment. However, acts such as the Endangered Species Act may provide a base for reviewing the substance of the agency's decision. The courts may also substantially assess the final decision under the arbitrary and capricious standard of the APA. So, while NEPA itself, it is procedural. It'll open it up to like litigation, and it provides the public with that information and other agencies, and opens it up to being being challenged as arbitrary and capricious, especially when you got So then, NEPA Section 105, the policies and goals set forth in this act are supplementary to those set forth in existing authorizations of federal agencies. I believe that like Section 105 is stating kind of what I just said a little bit. That the NEPA procedure is supposed to work with the other statutes like the Endangered Species Act to ensure that an agency selects the most environmentally beneficial action. This is stated with other statutes may impose substantive environmental obligations on federal agencies. This doesn't really all this all this doesn't mean like that NEPA is an insignificant law. Far from it. As mentioned earlier, NEPA ensures that its side effects are considered. It's informing the agency of the potential effects of their decision, but it also allows for judicial review of the decision by the agency under the arbitrary and capricious standard. And an EIS provides information that shows how an agency came to that decision that could be considered arbitrary and capricious, and gives the public information which can be used to fight the decision of the legislator. All right. What is categorical exclusion as used in the NEPA context? So, a categorical exclusion is an agency action that is not deemed a major federal action. This means that the act doesn't require does not significantly impact the quality of the human environment, and they don't need to do an environmental impact statement, and they just got to submit a record of decision. Usually they don't I know the book kind of elaborated on this, but most of the time, there's not enough available information at first to determine if something can be category excluded. So they'll at least have to do an environmental assessment, and then if the environmental assessment might find out, yeah, there's no finding of no significant action or significant impact, a FONSI, they can issue a FONSI, and then that, essentially then that's the end of the process. And I think that's what, going back to that road, that Forest Service road to the timber sales, that's what they did. The road, they said, they did the environmental assessment, and they're like, oh, this is a FONSI, there's no significant impact. Then they did it with the timber sales. They avoided having to do an environmental impact statement. All right, let's see. What is a categorical exclusion is used in the NEPA context? That again. What are the benefits of using categorical exclusions, and why can the use of categorical exclusions be controversial? Provide an example in your answer. This is one we actually haven't even done NEPA in class yet. This is all just from, I'm kind of pulling this from readings, but I think so. I think, well, obviously I'll be a little more informed on this, this coming week, because I guess we're going to spend at least at least two lecture periods. But I think he's shooting for 3 on this. So, a categorical exclusion, like I said in the last one, is an agency action not deemed a major federal action. They don't affect significantly the impact, or they don't significantly impact the quality of the human environment. No EIS required, and they can submit a record of decision. A benefit of using the categorical exclusion is that the agency doesn't have to produce an EIS for the action. And they can be controversial. Like I said, I'm kind of just freeballing on this one. But, maybe the proposal might have, there might be some extraordinary circumstances down the line with an action that, was originally considered to be, not significant. So it's, plus I'm not sure with the categorical exclusions if there's definitely not as much public, like I was thinking, like there's probably not as much public notice, especially without the EIS. Like those EISs provide a lot of public notice and ability to comment, whereas the categorical exclusion and the EAs, they don't quite as much. So it's, if you can get something categorically excluded, you can avoid having to deal with the public, which, is from whoever's point of view could be good or bad. I'm not trying to think of a statement there on that. All right, let's see. Describe one real or hypothetical example of how an outside interest might challenge a federal agency's implementation of NEPA as arbitrary and capricious as it relates to one of the following issues: scale of analysis, scope of analysis, connected actions, adequate consideration of environmental impacts, reasonable range of alternatives, use of categorical exclusion, cumulative effects, tiering, public participation, or supplementation of NEPA analysis. So there was one case in the book that I thought really kind of stood out, or at least, it was the one kind of they provided at least. Thomas versus Peterson. So this is the one I also kind of I've been talking about pretty much the whole time with NEPA about here's a little description. Implementation of a Forest Service road for timber sales. They created, separate EAs for the road and the multiple timber sales, and found individually that none equated a major federal action, and therefore they didn't need to make an EIS. And this is literally a textbook case of segmenting. The precedent required, former precedent had required when they found this, that, a single EIS that considers both the road and timber sales combined. You can't have the timber sales without the road. Without the road there, those timber sales would have never been possible. So they're connected actions, unless they were gonna like helicopter log it. But then I don't know. That's obviously not even in the question or anything like that. But yeah. And then also, they stay in the case that the U.S. Forest, Fish and Wildlife Service, EPA, and Idaho Fish and Game all asserted that the road and timber sales will have significant cumulative impacts that should be considered in an EIS. And so, yeah, subsequent phases, of development must be considered. Oh, here's a little thing. Yeah, this was also in there. So, subsequent cases of development must be considered in an EIS, They must be considered when the first phase would be irrational without the later phases. It would not make sense to build the road and then not sell the lumber it was built to access. Because I think that was like the case. That was the case that the Forest Service made, was like, oh, yeah, but the timber sales, they're not the only reason we built the road. The road also has some is also, for recreation. It's not just for the timber sales. That was, I think, that I might be kind of fudging it a little bit, but that was kind of how they sold it. And people were calling them on, hey, what the heck's going on here? But yeah, so that's like, I don't know. I think, from an arbitrary and capricious standpoint, yeah, I think it would be, the way they tried to sell this as not being, connected and avoiding having to do an EIS for the whole thing. And especially, when you got, multiple other agencies, federal and state, asserting that, hey, this is going to have some significant, cumulative impact effects that should be considered in an EIS. So I definitely, yeah, this one, I think, yeah, Professor Nie, when something's arbitrary and capricious, you'll kind of smell it. Yeah, this one smells arbitrary and capricious. I just don't see the rational connection between how they got from, like, how they could say that, yeah, this road, yeah, because, well, even I mean, the timber sales wouldn't be possible without the road, and it would be irrational to build the road if they weren't going to harvest the timber. So, yeah, I thought this was just a total arbitrary and capricious Forest Service decision. And then I guess this is the last question, and this one I kind of just touched on earlier today. I haven't even dug into it a whole lot, but the Bureau of Land Management just released its proposed roadmap for solar energy development on public lands. The final utility sale, solar energy programmatic environmental impact statement, and proposed resource management plan amendment, also known as the West Solar Plan. The press announcement says that no solar developments are authorized through this planning effort. The proposed project will still undergo site-specific environmental review and public comment. All right, so what does this mean, and what does this have to do with NEPA tiering? I guess, well, I'll kind of, like I said, I only dug into this a little bit, so I kind of just got into tiering. But yeah, tiering is just like preparing successive EISs from broad scale to small. So thus an agency often prepares a programmatic EIS on the overall program, considering the cumulative effects and overall objectives, and then prepares site-specific EISs on specific projects as they become more appropriate. They do not have to consider general effects each time it prepares an individual EIS. It does not have to be as comprehensive in a programmatic. And here, it's this tiering it's encouraged by the CEQ, which runs NEPA, but to they quote it as saying this is to eliminate repetitive discussions of the same issues and to focus on the actual issues ripe for decision at each level of environmental law. So yeah, they kind of made for the overall solar plan, they issue a programmatic EIS, which just covers like the broad effects and mitigation techniques and alternatives for the whole project. And then once they decide, where they're actually going to put in these solar farms, they're going to do much more specific EISs for those individual locations. But, they won't have to cover the broad stuff as much. They can focus in, save some time on these individual ones. And then the same thing goes for the big one. They don't have to focus in on the small details. They can stay kind of broad with it and save some time. This is just tiering seems to be in general just like a bit of a time saver, especially when you got a project like this, this wide scale, large scale project. And there was there was the case, the Metho Valley, the ski resort one, where they because at this point, no solar, like individual solar farms have been approved yet. They're not going to start building anything yet because before they'll actually build any of those actual solar farms, they'll have to actually complete an EIS at each of those sites. This is just proving the broad scale plan for it. And like I said, I haven't really dug into that one a whole lot, but that's that's all I got. I think next time I do this, I'm definitely gonna try to maybe get a little slideshow going or something, and yeah, I don't know. Like I said, this is literally just for myself to listen back to while I'm at work. But if anyone else does happen upon this, yeah, please, refute anything I say, because I definitely was pretty arbitrary and capricious myself with a lot of this. And yeah, feedback helps, conversation helps, talking about this stuff helps a lot. That definitely seems to be true. So yeah, I guess in that case, I think I'm all wrapped up. I definitely got to use the bathroom. So yeah, have a good one. Thanks for listening, watching.